I have never before needed sunglasses to speak to an audience. So please, I don't look nearly as good in them as you do. I don't want to shame you or your glasses by wearing that. So, my goodness. First of all, just to say, I'm so grateful to be here. It's humbling to speak to a group of people who will come and sit in temperatures that I'm sure within the next 45 minutes will approach 90 degrees. And but mostly, I'm grateful because life is difficult. Oh my gosh! Like you're wearing a mask to do this. Do I get to wear one of these too? Should I need to wear? No, I don't need to. Okay, all right. If I just suddenly stumble and fall over, like unconscious, you'll know why. Here's the thing. Life, no matter where you're coming from today, life is hard to do. It's just hard to do. There's just no question about it. Like, we live in a culture in which we would like to believe otherwise. We'd like to believe that life should be easy, and then when it's hard, like, that's a mistake. But the reality is, life is difficult to do. And more than anything else, the brain hates being alone. It hates having to do life in its difficulty by itself. And so, if life is going to be hard, I want it to be hard with other people. I want to be doing life with other people. And I'm glad to be here because if I'm here and you're here, I know that I'm not by myself in trying to do the next right thing. Like following Jesus is just hard work. Amen? All right. Oh, by the way, in the church that I attend in D.C., people talk to their preacher when he's preaching. So you can feel free to do that if you want to. Even people in the back if I can't hear you. All right, you're learning. Psychiatrists have ways with people. So a little background on me that would be, I think, pertinent to know. One, I'm the fourth of four sons. I grew up in Ohio, which means you're just genetically predisposed to cheer for a particular college football team there. Oh, Bo, right, okay. Yeah, but I have the microphone, and I'm going to, yeah. My parents were 45 when I was born, and I had brothers who were 18, 16, and 11. My father died when I was 17. My mother died about 12 years ago at age 86. I lost a brother to cancer 12 years ago, and I lost another brother to cancer 2 years ago. I've been married for 30 years, and I have a daughter who's 26, who's a newly ordained Presbyterian pastor. I have a son who's 23 who just started grad school in London. I don't deserve my life because of so much goodness and beauty and joy that's been part of it. One of the things that we are as human beings, as we develop, we are storytellers. You know, as the brain develops from birth through infancy, toddlerhood, we eventually get to a point where our brains begin to tell stories. We think things, we sense things, we image things. We tell stories. We're telling stories, in fact, like no other animal, as far as we know, tells stories. Now, I should say, we don't think dogs tell stories like we do. We don't think squirrels do. Boy, that really does have an odor to it, doesn't it? I'm just going to wander right over here. But eventually, we get to a place in our life where we begin to tell stories. And stories have certain features to them. These are not all the features, but the first feature that we would say about the way you tell stories is that your story began to be told by somebody else long before you ever came to the earth. Right? Because when your parents were pregnant with you, they started to talk about you. First, you made them sick, or at least you made your mother sick, and she thought these things about you. And then if you're like my mother, who in 1962, like if you're pregnant at age 45 in 1962, people worry, right? In my case, people are still worried. But in 1962, they were worried. And so you have someone who's also telling a story about, like, I wonder if he's going to be okay. They have hopes. They have dreams. Like, they're telling your story about you long before you get here. And in fact, that never stops, because when you're born, they still tell stories about you. They say, oh, isn't she cute? Doesn't he have his father's ears? Maybe that's a good thing, right? Whatever, like all these stories, and then they put you in clothes, right? They tell the story about like what you look like, things that you would never wear now, right, as a college student. People continue to tell your story, and it's important to know this. The way we tell stories and the way our brains work to help us tell them is always done collaboratively. You think that you are the solo author of your story, and it's just not true. Because we are constantly telling stories, thinking about our lives in context of what we think other people are thinking about us. We can't not do this. In addition, most of our storytelling doesn't actually involve language. Most of our storytelling involves all kinds of nonverbal stuff. Rhythm, tone, tenor, body language. I mean, if I could, I would just channel my talk through Jason. Right on? Right? Because if I could just like do the way he, like his rhythm and move and like all the cadence, all the like the storytelling is as much about things that are not words, right? It's the glance. It's the tone of voice. It's all the things that other people are doing, but that we are also doing as well about our stories. The other thing about stories is we don't tell them into thin air. We tell our stories because we want our stories to be heard. We desperately want to be heard and be known by others. Our minds don't work well in isolation, and when we think about things, when we tell those stories, we want those stories to be heard by someone else who can validate that. And that longing never stops. Here's the first question. In what story do you believe you're living? Oh, we might all say, well, I believe I'm living in the Christian story. If you're coming to Biola, a lot of people here, I would say that most people here might have some inkling of what it means to be a Christian. We believe that we're living in the Christian story, although here's the thing. Like for me, most of my day, often in my day, like I don't live as if I really believe that, right? Because already this morning, I'm nervous about speaking to 3,200 people. I'm worried about this, right? Because like we're outside, like they said earlier, like it's great to be in a beautiful place, and I'm the speaker. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like there's everything else to look here except at me. Right? Why not? Like so there's all kinds of ways in which we want to believe that I'm in the story, but I'm nervous. Like the notion that Jesus said, look, don't worry about tomorrow. Today's has enough worry of its own. Like I just don't believe that. I don't act as if that's true. So as much as I want to believe that I'm in the biblical narrative, a lot of my day is spent believing I'm in some other story. Are you with me? Yeah. But the story that I long for is a story of goodness and beauty and joy. That's the story that I want. I don't know any human beings that I've met in 25 years of practice, heck, in 54 years of life. I don't know anybody who would say, no, I'm not really interested in beauty or joy or goodness. I'm kind of like, no, I don't really need that. I don't know anyone who doesn't long for, who doesn't hunger, who doesn't thirst for that kind of a story. It's the kind of story that Steve longed for. Steve came to my office a few years ago in his mid to late 50s. And this is a guy who had everything that a guy needed. He was an accomplished scientist, way smarter than me, which may not take much. But I mean, he was way smarter than me, accomplished scientist. And he didn't understand why his marriage was falling apart. And he didn't understand why he was so cut off from his children. He didn't understand why he was suddenly becoming easily angry in the house, let alone easily angry. Like this dude was like, he was a Christian, right? So, and he was a deacon in his church. So he's like angry in deacon meetings. Isn't that great? Like, yes, I'm going to my deacon's meeting tonight, honey, just so I can be pissed off. Steve also longed for this world of goodness and beauty and joy, and for some reason, he was having a hard time finding it. And as we talked about his story, we discovered that there were parts of his story that were told early on over which he didn't have much control that were kind of challenging. For instance, Steve was a guy who grew up in a state in the country that's in the Midwest. It's in the northern part of the Midwest. I won't name it. It has lots of lakes. It has lots of gophers, but I'm not naming the state. It's cold and frozen for like 11 and a half months out of the year. And Steve grew up on a farm where he was the oldest of 5 kids. And Steve had a father who was brutal, also a deacon in his church. But this kind of brutal. Once when Steve was in first grade, he was 8 years old. One morning he was getting ready to go to school, and he'd gone upstairs to clean up and wash his hands after breakfast. And his father meets him at the top of the steps and says, "Have you washed your hands?" And he said, "Yes, I had. Did you use hot water?" Well, Steve, knowing that if he hadn't used hot water, which he hadn't, if he said, "No, I haven't," that he was in deep trouble. And so he lied and said, "Yes, I have." And so his father says, "Well, let's go see if you have." And he marches Steve back into the bathroom and turns on the hot water spigot. Of course, there was no hot water because I don't think, have hot water in this state. And they didn't, so his father takes him outside. Now, they lived on a farm, and their house bordered a creek, and it was January, and the creek was partially frozen. And his father takes him out, has Steve take off his shoes and socks into the frozen creek, and makes him stand up to his calves. He's 8. It's January. And he said, "Now that's what cold water really is." How is one going to escape that kind of a story? I want to suggest that the story of goodness and beauty and joy has been told by God from the beginning. And in fact, when we look at the biblical narrative, we see it early and often, right? We see in the very first chapter of Genesis a God of intention, a God who says, "I want to build a world, and I want this world to look like me, feel like me, act like me, and I want it to be one world of goodness, beauty, and joy." And so he starts to make things. There was a light and a darkness. And then he separates the water expanses, and then he separates the water from the land. He's all these things, day 1, day 2, and it was good. And it was good. And sometimes we read this text, and it's like watching paint dry. It was good, it was good, it was good, right? But it's like, it was good, and then God says, like, let's go have a party after day 1, right? And then, there are 6 parties in a row. There was light, there was land, there were the Ohio State Buckeyes, and it was good, right? And then in the 26th to 27th verse of the first chapter of Genesis, we get to this. We get to, "And God said, let us make mankind in our image." Now, it's a strange thing to me, looking at this, because you'd think that if the text were going to follow everything else that it said, that the text would go something like, "And God said, let there be mankind, and there was mankind." You know what I mean? No, it's like everything else that he just said, "Let there be," and it was. But he doesn't do that with human beings. As if he knows that, we probably need to think about this. We need to have a conversation about this. We're going to be reflective. We are going to be aware. And the text actually emphasizes that it was a they. It was not just one monadic God. It was a group of gods, right? It's Father, Son, Holy Spirit that together. Let us make mankind in our image, and then let us make them so that they live like we live. You can imagine them having a conversation, right? They're sitting around and thinking let us do this. And then there's, we don't get in on how the conversation went. But you can see at one point where Jesus might say, "Oh, this is a great idea, although there's that whole Good Friday thing. I'm seeing how this is going. I'm not sure this is such a good idea," right? We have to convince each other. And even knowing what they know, God still makes us. Because God is persuaded that we can, with him, create a world of goodness and beauty and joy. That's the world that Steve was looking for. That's the world that he wasn't finding in his marriage, he wasn't finding in his church, he wasn't finding with his kids, he wasn't finding it with his job, despite the fact that Steve knew a ton. He knows a lot. And then we come to the second chapter of Genesis, where God gets down in the mud and makes mankind. And we get to the 18th verse, and we hear this. And God said, it's not good for man to be alone, right? The neurobiology of human relationships would suggest that the single most important, one of the single most important features that enables us to flourish is our not just capacity for, but need to flourish in the presence of other people. And in fact, we won't have any sense of purpose apart from having that purposed story collaboratively told with other people. It's the only way our brain's going to work. It's not good for man to be alone. And then we get to the end of this chapter, and then words, right? He's made the man, he's made the woman, and the last verse of the second chapter of Genesis says, and the man and the woman were naked and unashamed. And I wonder to myself, why the word unashamed? I mean, yes, they're naked. And that's cool, right? But why unashamed? Like, the Hebrews had many other words that they could have used. They could have said they were naked and unafraid. They were naked and confident. They were naked and happy. Right? Because if I'm Adam and she's naked, I'm happy, right? So like we can just have these things that would just seem that much more obvious to be able to say, right? Why naked and unashamed? Now, good literature folks would say, well, look, in part, it's getting us ready for what's coming in chapter 3. Like, it's a good writer. The writer's priming us for what's coming. But I want to suggest to you that it's also describing some things about the nature of shame and how primal it is in terms of where it shows up in our life and the power that it has to undo everything about God's intention for a world of goodness and beauty and joy. In what story do you believe you're living? At one level, Steve thought he was living in one story, but the evidence was suggesting something totally different. God was making a world that was poised for greatness. And in order for us to create a new heaven and new earth of goodness and beauty and joy, something that is absolutely necessary is that we be vulnerable. In the text, the word naked is to imply that we are vulnerable with one another. This afternoon, we're going to talk about, and especially tonight, we're going to talk about why it's not just that we're vulnerable with one another, it's that we're vulnerable with people who are extraordinarily different than we are. People who don't hold the same values, people of different ethnicities, people of different genders, people of different occupations, people of different religious persuasions, a whole range of things in which, what does it mean for us to be vulnerable with that who is so utterly different than me? And I would suggest that when it comes to males and females, there's no two more different kinds of people on the planet. Right? We have things that we're similar, but the places where we're different, as far as the East is from the West. Amen? I mean, let's just be clear. When I married my wife, Phyllis, I thought I was really, what I thought, I said, yes, I'm affirming that I'm going to marry a woman, someone who's like me, right? Anybody here just like intentionally go out looking to date somebody who's categorically different than you? You just want, we have nothing in common, I just want to date you. No, we want to date somebody who's really like me. But as it turns out, I didn't really want somebody who was like me. I wanted somebody who was beautiful, but who was me. I want somebody who's just like me, who's exactly, I want her to think like I think. I want her to feel like I feel. I want her to talk as little as I talk, not as much as she does. I want all these different things. To live into a world of goodness and beauty and joy requires that we be vulnerable, and that we be vulnerable intentionally with those with whom we are different. This is God's mission, and evil knows this. You know, one of the things that we say in our work is that evil does its best work in the middle of good work being done. You know that? Evil does its best work in the middle of good work being done, right? So you come here to go to school, and that's ostensibly good work, apparently, right? You come here and you want to study. And the minute you start to study, you worry that you're not going to get good grades, get enough grades, right? Well, gosh, if I weren't doing the good work of going to school, I wouldn't be worried about getting the grades, right? Evil waits for good things to begin and joins the parade. What are the good things that you are right now doing, but in which you are recognizing evil is trying to stick its foot in the door, using shame and all that it means to disrupt that which God is trying to do with you? In Genesis 3, we find ourselves stumbling into a very different tale. A tale that was far different than the one that God imagined. In fact, we might not even find it to be the story that we think it is. When we tell this story, we kind of, if you've read the Bible, if you've read Genesis chapter 3 recently, we kind of know how it goes, right? So the serpent was the craftiest of all of the creatures that the Lord God had made. The craftiest. To be crafty is to intend to fool someone. You like to be fooled? You like being shamed? You like that kind of thing? Like, no, but it is his intention. It's not just by accident. It is important to know. Evil's intention is to use shame to destroy the world. And then we see this conversation that commences. And the conversation doesn't last that long. If it only lasts as long as the scripture tells us, it lasts like 3 minutes. It's not very long. Like it would be, which I would think would be very different because like he's talking to a woman. I think this would be extended into like 3 days. Like she would just want to have like talk, right? Like I think Eva would just get something, oh, I know, okay, right. I'm not supposed to be saying that, right? Okay, no, okay, I'm sorry. I apologize, I'm so ashamed. But notice what happens. Notice what happens. Evil says, is it true? Is it true that if you eat of this fruit that you'll die? And she said, well, we can't even touch it, let alone eat it. And he says, it's not true. It's not true. In fact, God doesn't want you to eat of this fruit because God knows that in the day you do, you will become like him, knowing good from evil. God does not want you to become like him. Do you hear that? Imagine this for a moment. And for some of us, this might not even have to be something we imagine. I have a patient who, when she was 19, was told that the person in her life whom for 19 years she thought was her father was really her uncle, and the person who had been her uncle all these years was really her father. Can you imagine what that would do to a person's mind? I've had patients who will have this experience. Imagine if you're 19 and you think you have a great relationship with your dad, a great relationship, transparent, open, he loves you, and he comes to you at 19 and he says, honey, I'm sorry, but I've got to go. I'm moving to Seattle. I have another family there. Can you imagine what that would be like? You see, because in our minds, when our Father tells us that he doesn't want to have anything to do with us, he's not really just telling us something about himself. He's telling us something about us. When the serpent tells Eve, look, God doesn't want you playing with his toys. He doesn't want you to have this knowledge because in that day you will become like him. He's not just telling Eve something about God. He's telling Eve something quite subtly about herself. Are you with me? The message is, if you were really loved by God, God would never do this to you. If you were really as important as you think you are, if you were really this loved, if you were really this kind of a delight to God, if you really were living in the world of goodness and beauty and joy that you think you were, I got news for you. Imagine what that would be like. And what I suggest to you is to consider the possibility that evil, even in that moment, is wielding shame long before any fruit gets eaten. Long before I have to pick fruit in order to cope with all of the distress that I'm experiencing because of this new story that is being told, long before that, shame is already at work. In our stories this morning, when we ask, in what story do we believe we're living? Where have we been hearing the voice of someone who says, you're not really enough for this. You're not really loved. You're not really your Father's delight. I will tell you, I have plenty of opportunities for feeling these things on a daily basis. And here's the thing, like most of the time when shame is at work anymore, shame doesn't require, in my life, shame doesn't require me to have somebody from the outside come up to me and say, there's something wrong with you, Kurt. No, like, I do it all by myself. Like, I'm really good at it. I tell people, look, I'm not just a sinner, I'm a professional sinner. Because I think if you do something for a really long time and you're really good at it, you can be called a professional. And I've been doing this for as long as I can remember. But part of how I do it is this constant barrage of things that I sense and image and feel that in some way, shape, or form have me thinking that I'm not enough. Most of how shame operates, by the way, for those of us who are here, most of how shame operates does not amount to large catastrophic events. Look, there are horrible things that have happened to people and continue to happen to people. Abuse, rape, poverty, racism. Horrible things. But the vast majority of the work that evil does in wielding shame, he does so in the privacy of our own heads. In the comings and goings of my thoughts and images and sensations and feelings and so forth and so on, in which I just simply reinforce over and over and over again this old story that the serpent was trying to fool the woman into believing. We have a phrase that we use in our work of interpersonal neurobiology that goes something like this. Those things to which we pay attention, to which we focus our attention, those things to which we focus our attention, we remember. And those things that we remember become our anticipated future. This is the way the brain works. Those things that we focus our attention on become the things that we remember. And the things that I remember become my anticipated future. Because my brain is, in many respects, among other things, one big anticipation machine. Everything from it, it's anticipating where my foot is going to fall as I walk across the stage, to my anticipation of how much longer is this guy going to be talking, to how hot it is, to my anticipation of like, gosh, I really hope I get to see my girlfriend after this is done. All these, like, just constantly going on over. We can't stop the brain from doing this. But what we anticipate is all going to be driven by what I'm paying attention to, and therefore remember, that becomes the grounding out of which I do said anticipation. And what if so much of the things that I'm paying attention to are the voices of shame? That's a lot of remembering my future that is not a world of goodness and beauty and joy. Are you with me? One of the things that Genesis 3 also tells us about this tree of the knowledge of good and evil is that it's a really big deal for us to know things, right? It says it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It doesn't say it's the tree of sensing good and evil. It's the tree of feeling good and evil. It's the tree of wondering whether or not good and evil exist in the world. No, it's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in fact, we would say that ever since, human beings have paid a high price for knowing things. I'm sure you are not paying a cheap price to come here, right? Because like college is not cheap anywhere, like anywhere. I mean, the only way that college isn't cheap is if you don't go, right? We want to know things because if I know things, then I have power. But moreover, if I know things, the more I can know, the less I need to depend upon you. The more I know, the more confident I can become that I can walk through this life and I don't have to worry about getting burned by you. The more I don't have to trust another human being. Knowing things is crucially important for the brain primarily as a protective mechanism. Now, it's not that knowing things is unimportant. I want to know that this is the right antibiotic to give to the child to help her and not give the wrong antibiotic and kill her. Like, knowing things is crucially important. But I want to suggest that the biblical narrative, and in fact, we see this in Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 27, this notion of us creating mankind. More than knowing things, much more than knowing things, is the process of what we call being known. Why is it that in the 8th chapter of 1 Corinthians, St. Paul says this: there are those who think they know things who do not know as they ought, but the person who loves God is known by God. Notice he doesn't say the person who loves God knows God. He says the person who loves God is known by God. Now, what we mean by that is this. In science, for us to know things, we need to set up experiments. We need to set up research protocols, which means that if I'm going to research something, I'm going to ask the questions. I need to ask questions in order to get information. But if I'm the one who asks all the questions, that means that the only answers that can ever come are the ones that I am linearly describing. I'm limiting those things. If I get to be the one who asks questions of God and of you, and that's fine, because then I don't have to reveal myself. I don't have to be vulnerable. I don't have to leave myself open to being hurt. I don't have to leave myself open to being shamed, as the woman discovered was happening to her with the snake. All, of course, while in the presence of her husband, right, who, like men, like present but silent, right, just not saying a thing. You see, because when a person comes into our office with their depression and their anxiety, or their abuse, or their drug addiction, or their bipolar disorder, or their psychosis, they put themselves in a position where they're not asking all the questions. They're putting themselves in a position in which they are being willing to let someone else ask them questions. Let me ask you this. If you were to give me the names of 3 people that when you told me their names, I were to poll them, they could tell me everything there is to know about you. Could you do it? Could you give me the names of 3 people who collectively could tell me everything that there is to know about you? They would know the last time you lost your temper. They would know the last time you looked at pornography. They would know the last time that you smoked weed. They would know what your deepest joys are. They would know what your highest hopes are. There would be nothing about you that is not known. I want to suggest that if we are going to be that well known, that is a deep act of vulnerability. And it is it makes me want to, I was raised as an evangelical Quaker, which means which means there are certain words you're not allowed to say, right? I was sitting at the dinner table, I was like 10. And somehow, I knew this, but we were sitting and why do I remember, there were peas. It was just peas, really, it was just green peas, but they were really hot. They were really hot. And I put them on, I'm like 10 years old, I know better. I don't even know that, I know better. I put them in my mouth, they burn my mouth, I say, Jesus Christ. Right, can you imagine, a little Quaker boy have those words coming out of his mouth? Well, fortunately, my father didn't, take me out and stick my feet in a cold creek. But, I got the message, right? Being this deeply vulnerable is a terrifying act. And God knows this. And he so knows this that he's willing to get in on the act himself. So we have this notion that to know things is what's the most important thing to do. I want to know things to have power. I don't want to be vulnerable. I want to hide in my shame. I want to stay away in my shame. I want to remain condemned in my shame. Now, when I say that I want to, I don't mean that I wake up in the morning and say, gosh, what can I do today to ensure that at the end of the day, I'm going to feel far worse at the end of the day than I feel right now? What can I do? Most of us don't wake up trying to do this. The problem is that we end up doing it anyway because so much of how our brains are wired to live like automatons. And I want to tell you that Jesus came to tell yet another part of this story that undoes all of this. Our friend Steve was in trouble because he was cut off from himself, he was cut off from his kids, he was cut off from his wife, he was cut off from his God. What he didn't know was that he was cut off also from all of that history and story and emotion and trauma that had been driving his life up to the moment that he walked into my office. And here's the thing, as smart as he was, he didn't understand why he wasn't smart enough to keep his symptoms from emerging. He didn't understand why all of his education hadn't prepared him to keep all of this crap from unfolding. All of his schooling that had taught him to know, to know, to know. I said, well, Steve, I said, fortunately, you're in good company. Steve was discovering that his shame was running his life. And as I said, well, as I will say to you, the news about shame is far worse than you know. Do you think it's bad? It's worse. But the news about shame is also far better than you can imagine. And this is where Jesus gets involved. So, you know, it is interesting that, like, Jesus doesn't show up in a Tesla, right? He doesn't show up in a chariot. He shows up, how? Naked. He shows up vulnerable. God says from the beginning, let them live like we live, and I'm going to show them how to do it. He shows up naked, and then he grows up, and then he starts to hang out with people, and then he starts to teach. And in the Gospel of John, there's this classic series of things called the 7 I Ams. Jesus says, I am the light of the world, I am the bread of life, I am the gate. There are 7 things that he says. For those of you who might be familiar, and we who are believers, rightly think of these things as comments, as reflections, as declarations of comfort and joy. These are great things for us to be aware of that Jesus is for us. But I want to tell you something else. These are the things that got him killed. Jesus is not just making factual declarations of who he is. He's also being terribly vulnerable. He's revealing things about who he is, just telling the truth about his personhood in a world in which to do so is potentially going to create trouble, and it did. What's so powerful about this, though, is that it didn't stop the story. Because even after crucifixion, in which he was also naked, like one of the things we say, like if you were to Google images for crucifixion, you'd have about 200 images on your first page that you'd see, and probably all but 2 of them would be inaccurate, right? Because all of our crucifixes have Jesus wrapped in a loincloth, right? And this is not some psychiatrist's bid to have all those loincloths taken off. It is to say this, like the Romans stripped you naked. They wanted people to see your package out there. That's what they wanted to see. Like they wanted, like crucifixion was not just, they had other ways they could kill people. They wanted to humiliate you. And they wanted to humiliate everybody else around. Jesus came into the world naked, he leaves the world naked, and in his tomb, God comes to get him. Who's coming to get you? Who in your life, as the breath of Jesus himself, is coming to get you? Dr. Johnson, I'm like, that's just amazing. Like the friend that you described who didn't just wait for you to call her if you needed her, but who came to get you, who came to find you. By whom are you so well known, such that, like Jesus coming to find us, and God the Father coming to find Jesus in his tomb, is in a position to find you such that in your shame, in your vulnerability, you are given the freedom and the energy to co-create with God a new world of goodness and beauty and joy. Imagine this. If you couldn't be ashamed, if it were not possible, if I could wave my shrink-o-matic wand, That was funny. If I could wave my Shrinkomatic wand and it would be impossible for you to be inappropriately ashamed, what would you create? What risk would you take? What conversation would you have? What major would you switch? Because you really don't want to be a lawyer, you want to teach middle school. What relationships cross-culturally would you develop? What worlds of goodness and beauty and joy would you, with the Holy Trinity, be co-creating as we practice for heaven? There is only one way to do this. It is to be naked and unashamed. It is to be known, remembering that knowing is crucially important, all in the service of being known, all in the service of developing a world in which God comes to live with us in his and our fullness. It's important to know, Jesus didn't come to the earth to save people so that, like, when the world's done, he just, like, takes us all to heaven. Like, God doesn't need, gosh, I'm a few 100 trillion people short of people in my heaven. I'm just going to go make some and then bring them here so they can be with me. He's not lonely. He wants a world of goodness and beauty and joy, and he wants us to be part of that. And how can we, even now, in these years that you are here, create the time, create the space, create the practices of being known in such a way that you give God the space to move into all those nooks and crannies where shame lives, to have them revealed, to have them healed, to have them regenerated, such that you are with him on this co-creation mission. For Steve, as we said at the top of our time, life was hard. In the course of our conversations, he eventually agreed to join a group of men that I helped to facilitate conversations with over the course of time, in which these men come to be deeply known by other men. We have other groups in our practices for women as well. And in the course of them learning about all kinds of things that the mind is about, it's about attention, it's about memory, it's about the brain, it's about concentration, it's about attachment, it's about storytelling. But mostly, it is really about the question of answering, in what story do you believe you're living? I want to tell you that no matter which one it is, and no matter where you find yourself this day, in Jesus, God has come to find you. He will not let you go, as together we look forward to the world of a new heaven and new earth, a world of goodness and beauty and joy. Thanks be to God.
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.